If you had asked my parents to describe me in one word, they wouldn't have hesitated. Disappointment. That was the word. Not behind my back. Not in whispers. Out loud. At dinner tables. At family gatherings. At church. For 24 years, I was the cautionary tale. And my older sister, Caroline, was the masterpiece. She had the polished smile, the perfect GPA, the debate trophies lined like medals of war across our living room shelves. My father loved to gesture toward them when guests came over. "That's my future CEO," he would say, resting his hand proudly on her shoulder. When I once asked what I was going to be, he didn't even look up from his phone. Hopefully married to someone successful. Everyone laughed, including my mother. Caroline was 2 years older than me. 2 years and an entire universe apart. She went to private schools. I went to public. She had SAT tutors. I had a part-time job at 16. She studied economics. I studied art history. And according to my parents, that was proof enough that I had no ambition. They never said I was lazy. They said something worse. "You just don't have the brain for real success." You'd think after hearing that for 2 decades, I would believe it. For a while I did. Until the night everything changed. It was Caroline's graduation celebration. She had just completed her MBA from one of the most prestigious universities in the country. The kind of place my father introduced by name every time he mentioned it, just to watch people's reactions. The party was held at a country club outside Boston. Crystal chandeliers, white linen tables, a string quartet playing near the fountain. My parents spared no expense. It wasn't just a celebration. It was a coronation. Caroline wore a white tailored suit. My mother cried when she saw her. "My brilliant girl," she whispered. I stood beside the champagne tower, refilling glasses for guests who barely remembered my name. I had just finished my master's degree in museum curation. No one asked about it. Halfway through the evening, my father tapped his fork against a wine glass. The room quieted. He loved speeches, especially when he was the center of them. "Friends, family," he began, smiling wide. "Tonight we celebrate not just a graduation, but the future." He wrapped his arm around Caroline. "She will be taking on a leadership role in the family company starting this fall." Applause erupted. I clapped too. Then he continued. "And because we believe in rewarding excellence, your mother and I have decided that Caroline will inherit the Hamptons property and the Beacon Hill townhouse." There were murmurs of admiration. He wasn't done. "She'll also receive the majority shares of Whitmore Holdings when the time comes." My stomach tightened. Whitmore Holdings was worth a lot. I tried not to calculate it. Then someone asked the question I had been dreading. "And what about your younger daughter?" Silence. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me. My father chuckled. "Oh, Emily is still finding herself." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Then he said the sentence that split my life into before and after. "We've decided not to include her in the estate structure. It's better to invest where there's proven return." Proven return. Like I was a stock. Like I was a failed investment. Caroline didn't look at me. My mother sipped her champagne. I felt heat rise behind my eyes, but I refused to cry. Not there. Not in front of their audience. I placed my glass down carefully, walked to the restroom, locked myself in a stall. And for the first time since childhood, I let myself shake. It wasn't about the money. It was about the announcement, the humiliation, the public confirmation that I was expendable. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that someone else had been watching, quietly, carefully. My grandmother, my father's mother. She hadn't attended the party. Officially, it was because she was too frail. Unofficially, it was because my father didn't like being reminded of where he came from. Grandma Rose never went to college. She started as a seamstress in Queens. Widowed at 32. Built a small textile distribution business from nothing. Sold it decades later for more than my father ever admitted. He liked to tell people he built everything himself.
He didn't.
Grandma never corrected him. She just observed. And she observed everything, including me. I was the only one who visited her consistently, not out of obligation, but because I liked her. She told stories that weren't polished, stories about survival, about grit, about losing everything and rebuilding anyway. She once told me, "Smart isn't always loud, Emily. Sometimes it's quiet, watchful." 3 days after the party, I received a call. Her lawyer wanted to see me.
Alone.
I assumed it was about medical directives or something routine. I drove to Manhattan in silence. The office overlooked Central Park. The lawyer, Mr. Abrams, greeted me with a strange expression. Not pity, not sympathy, something closer to anticipation. "Emily," he said gently, "your grandmother has amended her will." I blinked. "She's not. She's alive," he assured me. "Very much so." Relief flooded through me. Then why am I here? He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were documents, numbers, pages and pages of numbers. "I'm going to explain this carefully," he said, but I barely heard him, because on the first page, bold and unmistakable, was my name, sole beneficiary of something called the Rosewood Trust. I looked up. "This must be a mistake." "It's not," he replied. And then he said the number. $42 million in diversified assets, real estate, private equity, long-term stock positions. 42 million. I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. "I think you have the wrong granddaughter." He smiled faintly. "Your grandmother was very specific." My heart pounded. "She also left instructions," he continued. "You are not to disclose this to your parents immediately." I swallowed. "Why?" He folded his hands. "Because she wanted to see who they were without knowing." And suddenly, I understood. The public humiliation, the exclusion, the careful observation. Grandma had been watching the same show I had, only she had been writing a different ending. I drove back to my tiny apartment in Brooklyn that night with my head spinning. $42 million. The girl who wasn't worth investing in. The failed return. The disappointment. Worth more than the empire my father bragged about. But here's the thing. The money wasn't the most powerful part. The most powerful part was patience. Because I didn't tell them. Not when my mother called to remind me that Caroline would need help planning her executive wardrobe. Not when my father forwarded me articles about finding practical careers. Not when Caroline posted photos of the Beacon Hill townhouse captioned, "Grateful for parents who believe in me." I waited, and I learned, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't powerless. I was quiet, and quiet can be dangerous. This was no longer about inheritance. This was about truth. And my grandmother had just handed me the first move. I didn't sleep that night. $42 million doesn't let you sleep. But it wasn't excitement that kept me awake. It was clarity. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the weakest person in the room. I just looked like I was. The next morning, I met with Mr. Abrams again. This time, he explained the details. The Rosewood Trust wasn't just a transfer of wealth. It was structured, layered, strategic. Grandma hadn't raised fools. "Your grandmother built this trust to protect you," he said, sliding a breakdown across the desk. The assets weren't liquid cash sitting in a vault. They were diversified holdings, commercial properties in Manhattan and Miami, long-term stock positions in energy, tech, and healthcare, minority stakes in 2 mid-sized logistics companies, and one silent investment I didn't expect, 7% of Whitmore Holdings, my father's company. I stared at him. "That's impossible." "It's not," he said calmly. "She retained those shares when your father expanded. He assumed she transferred everything to him. She didn't." I felt something unfamiliar rise inside me. Not anger, not joy, power. "She also placed a condition," Mr. Abrams continued. "Of course she did." I braced myself. The trust fully transfers to you in 12 months. 12.
Yes.
During that time, you're expected to remain financially independent. No sudden lifestyle changes, no disclosures, and no financial assistance to immediate family. I almost smiled. Grandma wasn't just protecting me.
She was studying them.
And if I break the condition, the trust converts to a charitable foundation. She knew exactly how to keep me disciplined. I left the office that day understanding something critical. This wasn't revenge money. It was leverage. And leverage only works when no one knows you have it. So I went back to my normal life. My tiny Brooklyn apartment with the broken radiator. My museum internship that barely paid. My thrift store coats. Meanwhile, Caroline's life was accelerating. Within weeks, she started at Whitmore Holdings. My father posted about it on LinkedIn like he'd personally invented her brain. Proud to welcome the next generation of leadership. She moved into the Beacon Hill townhouse. $13 million of polished marble and imported Italian fixtures. And then the cracks began. At first, they were small. Caroline called me late one night, which was unusual. She never called unless she needed something. "Do you know anything about logistics modeling?" she asked, trying to sound casual.
No, I said.
"You're the MBA." Silence. Then a sigh. "They've put me in charge of the West Coast distribution restructuring." "That sounds important." "It is." She didn't say what we both knew. Important meant high stakes. High stakes meant scrutiny. 2 weeks later, there was an article in a financial newsletter. Whitmore Holdings had delayed a major shipping contract. Stock dipped 3%. Nothing catastrophic, but noticeable. At Sunday dinner, my father was tense. Caroline defended her projections aggressively. "It's a short-term correction," she insisted. He nodded, but his jaw was tight. And for the first time in my life, no one made a joke about me. They were too distracted. I observed quietly, like Grandma taught me. Then something else happened. My mother called me one afternoon, her voice sweet in that artificial way she used when she wanted something. "Emily, honey, your sister is under a lot of pressure. Maybe you could help her with some presentation design? You're good with creative things." Creative things. That's what they reduced my degree to. I almost laughed, but instead I said yes. Because information is currency. When I walked into Whitmore Holdings for the first time as an adult, I saw it differently. Not as my father's kingdom, but as an ecosystem. And ecosystems have weak points. Caroline's office was pristine, minimalist, immaculate, but her desk was chaos. Spreadsheets open, forecasts misaligned. She looked tired. For the first time in my life, she didn't look invincible. "Don't read into the stock dip," she said quickly, defensive before I even spoke. I didn't say anything. She exhaled. "They expect me to perform at Dad's level immediately." "Well," I said carefully, "he's had 30 years. She stared at me, as if it had never occurred to her. We worked on her presentation for hours. And that's when I saw it. Not incompetence, but fragility. Caroline wasn't a genius. She was conditioned. Conditioned to win. Conditioned to perform. Conditioned to chase validation. And now she was drowning in it. On my way out, I passed the boardroom. The door was slightly open. Inside, I saw a man I recognized from the trust documents. Martin Keller, major shareholder. Sharp, cold, calculating. He wasn't applauding Caroline's rise. He was measuring it. That night, I called Mr. Abrams. "Is there any legal restriction on me increasing my stake in Whitmore Holdings?" Pause. "Not directly, but acquisitions would need to be discreet." "How discreet?" "Very." That was the moment my plan began to take shape. Not to destroy my father, not to humiliate Caroline, but to protect what my grandmother built. Because here's what I realized. If Caroline failed publicly, the board would circle. If the stock dropped significantly, investors would look for leadership change. And my father's empire wasn't as invincible as he thought. It was leveraged, aggressively leveraged. Expansion loans, risk-heavy contracts. Grandma had kept her 7% for a reason, not sentiment.
Control.
Over the next 3 months, quietly, carefully, through intermediaries, I acquired an additional 4%. Minority stakes sold by smaller investors who wanted liquidity. No headlines, no noise, just paperwork. 7 became 11. 11% doesn't sound powerful until you realize that in a divided board, it's decisive. Meanwhile, Caroline's restructuring project began to wobble. Projected savings didn't materialize. Transportation costs spiked. A competitor undercut one of their contracts. Stock dipped again. 5% this time. At another family dinner, my father snapped. "Leadership isn't theoretical, Caroline." She stiffened. "I know. Do you?" My mother intervened quickly. "She just needs time." And then, as if muscle memory, my father glanced at me, waiting for the comparison. The usual jab, the reminder of who was superior. But this time he said nothing, because for the first time, I wasn't beneath them. I was outside the game, and they didn't even know I was holding pieces. A week later, I visited Grandma. She was sitting by the window of her Upper East Side apartment, wrapped in a soft gray shawl. "You look different," she said immediately.
How?
Less apologetic. I sat beside her. "I know about the shares," I said quietly. She didn't look surprised. "Good. Why me?" She turned slowly toward me. "Because you listen." Silence settled between us. "I'm not trying to hurt them," I said. "I know, but I won't be small anymore." Her lips curved slightly. "Then don't." When I left that day, I understood something fully. This wasn't revenge. Revenge is loud. This was repositioning. And repositioning requires timing. Caroline had no idea that the board was growing impatient. My father had no idea that control wasn't as absolute as he believed. And neither of them knew that the disappointment daughter owned 11% of their future. Quietly, patiently, waiting. The collapse didn't happen overnight. It happened the way most collapses do. Quietly. Then all at once. It started with a contract. A major West Coast distribution deal Caroline had championed. Projected to increase annual revenue by 18%. Aggressive, ambitious, and built on numbers that assumed everything would go perfectly. Nothing went perfectly. Fuel prices surged. A key partner missed performance benchmarks. 2 shipping hubs failed compliance audits within the same quarter. By the time the quarterly earnings call arrived, Whitmore Holdings had missed projections by a wide margin. Stock dropped 12% in a single day. 12% doesn't just hurt. It panics. Financial news outlets picked it up. Is Whitmore losing its edge? Leadership transition raises questions. My father went into damage control mode. Public statements. Confident tone. Temporary setbacks. Long-term vision. But behind closed doors, the board was restless. And Martin Keller was circling. I knew because Mr. Abrams knew. And Mr. Abrams heard things. "There's talk of restructuring leadership," he told me during one of our quiet lunches. Meaning, they won't remove your father immediately. But Caroline's position is vulnerable. I didn't feel triumph. I felt something more complicated. Because no matter how she treated me, she was still my sister. But she had stepped into a role she wasn't ready for. And my father had pushed her there to prove a point, not to build something stable. That Sunday, I was invited to dinner. Not casually, formally, which meant tension. Caroline looked exhausted. Dark circles under perfectly applied concealer. My father didn't waste time. "The board is questioning the West Coast strategy." She nodded. "I know. They're suggesting operational oversight. Translation. Supervision. Humiliation disguised as support." My mother tried to smooth it over. "They just want stability." Caroline's fork clinked against her plate. "I can handle it." My father leaned back. "Prove it." Then he looked at me. Again. But this time, there was no joke. No dismissal. Only calculation. Because something had shifted. He didn't know what. but he sensed it. After dinner, Caroline cornered me near the driveway. "You've been meeting with someone," she said suddenly. My pulse stayed steady. "What?" "Don't lie to me. I saw you near Keller's office last month." I almost smiled. "I helped you with the presentation." "That's not what I mean." She studied my face, searching for weakness, for guilt. "I'm not your competition," I said evenly. Her expression flickered, and for a split second, I saw fear. Not of me, of losing everything she'd been promised. 2 days later, the board scheduled an emergency session. Not public, internal, closed. I wasn't invited, officially, but as an 11% shareholder, I had the right to attend. I hadn't planned to use it yet, but then something unexpected happened. Grandma was hospitalized. Minor stroke. Stable, but fragile. I rushed to the hospital. My father was already there, pacing. He looked smaller under fluorescent lights. "She's asking for you," he said quietly. "Not Caroline. Me." When I entered her room, she reached for my hand. "Time," she whispered. I leaned closer. "For what?" Her grip tightened. "Stop waiting." And I understood. Waiting wasn't strength anymore. It was hesitation. The next morning, I made a decision. I instructed Mr. Abrams to formally notify Whitmore Holdings of my attendance at the emergency board session. There was silence on the other end of the phone. Then, "I assume you're ready." "Yes." The boardroom felt colder than I remembered. Long mahogany table, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Martin Keller glanced at me first. No surprise in his eyes, only acknowledgement. My father froze when I entered. Confusion, then irritation. "What is this?" I placed my folder on the table calmly. Shareholder attendance. Caroline's face drained of color. The meeting began tensely. Financial summaries, risk assessments, concerns about leadership optics. Then Keller spoke. "We need structural stability. Investors are uneasy." My father responded sharply. "This company has survived worse." "Yes," Keller said coolly, "under experienced guidance." The implication hung heavy. Caroline's hands trembled slightly on the table. And then, I spoke. For the first time in that room. "As a shareholder," I said evenly, "I'm less concerned about optics and more concerned about over-leveraging expansion without contingency buffers." Silence. My father stared at me like I'd started speaking another language. I continued. "The West Coast projections assumed fuel stability and flawless compliance. That wasn't risk management. That was optimism." Keller's eyebrow lifted slightly. Caroline's jaw tightened. "I propose we temporarily pause aggressive expansion," I said, "and shift focus to internal efficiency stabilization. Reduce exposure. Rebuild investor confidence before scaling further." One board member leaned forward. "And you are?" I met his gaze. "Emily Whitmore, 11% shareholder." The room shifted. Energy recalibrated. My father's face changed in real time. From confusion, to realization, to something dangerously close to fear. 11%. He repeated slowly. "Yes." "How?" "Grandma." The word landed like a detonator. Keller exhaled quietly, as if a long-anticipated moment had arrived. Discussion resumed. But the dynamic had changed. I wasn't decoration. I wasn't a liability. I was leverage. By the end of the session, a temporary oversight committee was formed. Caroline would remain in position, but expansion would halt. Risk would be reviewed, and I was appointed to the advisory subgroup. When the meeting adjourned, my father approached me. "Alone." "How long?" he asked. "A while." "You planned this?" "No," I said calmly. "You did." His eyes darkened. "You think you can outmaneuver me?" I held his gaze. "I don't need to. Because here's the truth. I didn't want his throne. I wanted balance. But he had built a kingdom on hierarchy. And hierarchies don't like equality." That night, my phone rang. "Caroline." You humiliated me. I stabilized the company. You ambushed us. I protected my investment. Silence. Then, you were always jealous. I almost laughed. No, I said softly. I was always invisible. And invisibility had become my advantage. The stock stabilized over the next 2 weeks. News cycles moved on. Crisis cooled. But inside our family, nothing was calm. Because now they knew the disappointment daughter wasn't broke, wasn't clueless, wasn't small. I had stepped into the light, and there was no going back. But the real twist, the one none of us saw coming, was still ahead. Because power shifts don't just change companies. They expose secrets. And one of those secrets was about to shatter everything we thought we knew. Power changes the temperature of a room. But truth? Truth changes the air you breathe. After the board meeting, my father stopped underestimating me. But he didn't start respecting me. He started investigating me. Within days, I could feel it. Subtle questions. Sudden curiosity about my finances. A request from his assistant asking for a friendly conversation. I declined. Caroline avoided me completely, which somehow hurt more than her insults ever had. Then Grandma asked to see me again. She had been discharged from the hospital, weaker but sharp as ever. When I walked into her apartment, the curtains were half drawn, golden late afternoon light cutting across the floor. She didn't waste time. You stepped in. Yes. Good. She studied my face carefully. They know now. Yes. She nodded slowly. It's time you know too. A chill ran through me. Know what? She gestured to the armchair beside her. I sat, and she took a long breath. Your father isn't afraid of losing money, she said quietly. He's afraid of losing image. I've noticed. There's a reason. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the blanket over her knees. When I built my first company, your grandfather had already passed. Your father was 12. I'd heard parts of this before, but not like this. He hated that I worked, she continued. He hated that I wasn't home every afternoon like the other mothers. That doesn't explain. Let me finish. Her voice sharpened just enough to stop me. When he was 16, he made a mistake. A serious one. I frowned. What kind of mistake? She looked directly at me. The kind that makes families lie. The room felt smaller. He got a girl pregnant. I blinked. What? She was 17. From Queens. Not wealthy. Not connected. My chest tightened. What happened? Her parents wanted marriage. Your father wanted freedom. My mind raced. Did he? She refused to give the baby up at first. My pulse pounded in my ears. Grandma, she gave birth. Silence. Then, she died 2 days later. The words dropped like glass. I felt cold all over. And the baby? I whispered. Grandma's eyes didn't leave mine. I brought her home. My breath stopped. The air disappeared. No, I said faintly. Yes. The world tilted. You, she said gently, are not your mother's biological daughter. The sound that left my mouth wasn't quite a laugh. Not quite a sob. That's not possible. It is. My thoughts scattered violently. All the years, all the comparisons, all the subtle distance. My mother's polite affection. Never warmth, never softness. Caroline's easy resemblance to both parents. And me, the different features. The quiet comments from distant relatives. You don't look like your sister. I had brushed it off. I hadn't wanted to see it. They agreed to raise you, Grandma continued. But only on one condition. My voice barely worked. What condition? That no one would ever know. The humiliation at the graduation party replayed in my mind. The public disinheritance. The dismissal. Not just favoritism. Resentment. You were never a disappointment, Grandma whispered. You were a reminder. Of his mistake. Of the scandal. Of the life he tried to erase. Tears streamed down my face before I realized I was crying. So they punished me for existing. Yes. The simplicity of it shattered something inside me. All those years of trying to prove myself, to earn love, to compete with Caroline. I wasn't losing a competition. I was never in one. Caroline wasn't the golden child because she was smarter. She was the legitimate one. And I was the secret. I kept my shares, Grandma said quietly, because I knew one day you would need protection. Protection. Not revenge. Not power. Protection. I was going to tell you earlier, she continued, but I needed you strong first. I covered my mouth with my hands. Every memory rewired itself in seconds. The way my father never hugged me for long. The way my mother corrected my posture in public, but never comforted me in private. The way Caroline sometimes looked at me with something close to guilt. Does she know? I asked. Yes. The word cut. How long? Since she was 14. 14. All those years. And she had never told me. I stood abruptly, pacing. My heart was racing so hard I thought I might faint. So, what am I supposed to do with this? Grandma's voice softened. Decide who you are without them. That night, I didn't go home. I walked. For hours. Through Manhattan. Through memories. Through grief I didn't have language for. I wasn't just excluded from inheritance. I had been excluded from truth. And yet, Grandma chose me. Not out of guilt. Not out of obligation.
But because she saw me.
The next morning, my father called. We need to talk. His tone was controlled.
Tight.
I agreed. When I arrived at his office, Caroline was already there. Her eyes were red. He closed the door behind me. You've been digging, he said. I didn't have to. His jaw clenched. What did she tell you? So he knew. Of course he knew. I held his gaze. I know. Silence expanded like a vacuum. Caroline's lip trembled. We didn't want you hurt, she whispered. I laughed through tears. Hurt. My father's voice sharpened. It was complicated. No, I said quietly. It was selfish. His composure cracked. You think this was easy? I was 17. And I was innocent. That landed. He looked away. For the first time in my life. He looked ashamed. But shame doesn't erase damage. I spent my whole life trying to earn something that was never available, I said steadily. Do you understand that? No one answered. Because they did. And that was worse. I took a breath. I'm not here to destroy you. Caroline looked up quickly. Then what do you want? I thought about Grandma's words. Protection. Identity.
Choice.
I want transparency, I said. Full disclosure to the board about ownership structure. No more secrets. My father's eyes snapped back to mine. You wouldn't. I would. This wasn't revenge. This was boundary. He studied me, calculating. Finally, he nodded once. Slowly. Fine. Caroline started crying quietly, not because she lost status, but because the illusion was gone. And illusions are comfortable. Truth isn't. As I walked out of that office, I felt lighter, not victorious, not triumphant, just clear. I wasn't the disappointment. I wasn't the outsider. I wasn't the mistake. I was the consequence of their choices, and the architect of my own future. But the final shift, the one that would redefine everything, was still waiting. Because inheritance isn't just money, it's legacy. And I was about to decide what kind of legacy my name would carry. There's a strange kind of silence that follows truth. It's heavier than lies, but cleaner. After the confrontation in my father's office, nothing exploded publicly. No scandal, no dramatic headlines. But inside Whitmore Holdings, everything shifted. True to his word, my father disclosed the updated ownership structure to the board. Not the paternity, just the shares. Grandma's retained stake. My expanded position. Transparency about voting power. There were raised eyebrows. Private conversations, strategic recalculations, but no chaos. Because the company, for the first time in years, wasn't overexposed. Expansion had paused, risk was controlled, and the market responded. Slowly, steadily, the stock stabilized, then began to climb. Not dramatically, but sustainably. Keller requested a private meeting with me. "You surprised me," he said, studying me across the polished conference table. "I didn't plan to. You could have forced a leadership vote." "Yes, but you didn't." I met his gaze calmly. "Destruction is expensive." He smirked slightly. "You're more like your grandmother than your father." That wasn't an insult. It was the highest compliment I'd ever received. Caroline, on the other hand, withdrew. She showed up to meetings. She did her work, but something in her head cracked. Not arrogance. Certainty. One evening, she came to my apartment. Not the townhouse. Not the office. My apartment. She stood awkwardly near the doorway. "I didn't know how to tell you," she said quietly. "About what?" "About you." There it was. The thing we had both been avoiding. "How long?" I asked. She swallowed. 14. I overheard Mom crying one night. I confronted them. "And you just kept it?" I was scared. "Of what?" She looked at me, eyes shining. "That if you knew, you'd stop loving us." The irony hit like a wave. "You thought I'd leave." Yes. I let that sit between us. For years, I had believed she saw me as inferior. Maybe sometimes she did. But underneath it, she had been protecting the illusion too. Because illusions protect everyone. Until they don't. "I don't hate you," I said finally. Her shoulders dropped slightly. "I hated competing with you," I continued, "for something that wasn't even real." Tears slipped down her face. "I never wanted you to feel small, but you let it happen." She nodded. "I know. Accountability, not excuses." That was new. We didn't hug dramatically. We didn't fix 20 years in one conversation. But we sat, and for the first time, we spoke as equals. Not rivals. Not roles. Just two women raised inside a story they didn't fully write. A week later, I made my final decision. I called a board meeting. Not emergency. Planned. Structured. Calm. When everyone was seated, I stood. As a significant shareholder, I began. "I believe the long-term strength of Whitmore Holdings depends on governance evolution." My father's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "I'm proposing a structural adjustment." A pause. "I will transfer 4% of my personal holdings into a non-voting family trust dedicated to employee equity programs." Murmurs filled the room. "This creates long-term retention incentives and stabilizes internal loyalty." Keller leaned back slowly, calculating. "And leadership?" one board member asked. "I recommend maintaining current executive positions," I said, glancing briefly at Caroline, "with continued oversight and performance benchmarks." I wasn't taking his throne. I wasn't pushing her out. I was reshaping the ground beneath all of us. The vote passed, not unanimously, but decisively. Afterward, my father approached me again. But this time, there was no anger, only something fragile. "You could have taken everything," he said quietly. "I know. Why didn't you?" I looked at him carefully. "Because I don't need to prove I'm worthy anymore." His eyes filled, just slightly. He nodded once. It wasn't redemption, but it was recognition. Grandma passed 3 months later, peacefully, in her sleep. At her memorial, people spoke about her resilience, her brilliance, her strength. But what I remembered most was her patience. After the service, I stood alone for a moment. $42 million. A seat at the table. A rewritten identity. But none of that was the real inheritance. The real inheritance was this. I no longer needed their validation. Not my father's pride. Not my mother's approval. Not my sister's comparison. I had built my own ground to stand on. And it was solid. A year after the graduation party, the one where I was publicly written off, we gathered again. Same country club, different tone. This time, the event wasn't about hierarchy. It was about the employee equity launch. Whitmore Holdings had posted its strongest stable quarter in 5 years. Caroline gave the speech. Confident, measured, earned. And when she finished, she looked at me before stepping down. Not above me, not ahead of me, beside me. Later that evening, my father raised a glass. Not dramatically, not theatrically. To family, he said. Simple, but different. Because this time, I wasn't the cautionary tale. I wasn't the invisible one. I wasn't the mistake. I was the quiet force they underestimated. And I didn't destroy them. I outgrew them. That's the thing about revenge. The most satisfying kind isn't loud. It isn't cruel. It doesn't burn everything down. It's controlled, intentional, dignified. They thought I was a bad investment. Turns out, I was the long-term strategy. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. You don't have to ruin people to reclaim your power. Sometimes the strongest move is simply refusing to stay small. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or made to feel like you didn't belong, I see you, and your story isn't over. Make sure you subscribe to Life Confessions for more real, powerful stories about family, betrayal, strength, and rising with dignity. Because sometimes the quiet ones change everything.